The streets of Budapest glistened under the dim glow of amber streetlights. Beyond the echo of trams rattling in the distance, silence lingered like a blanket over the city. Inside the old St. Margaret Hospital, time seemed to move differently. The walls were a pale shade of green, chipped with age, carrying the scent of antiseptic that never truly faded. Esther Kovacs adjusted her white uniform as she entered the ward for her night shift. The corridors stretched long and narrow, their shadows curling into the corners. It was the kind of silence that made even the smallest sound of a shoe sole against the tiled floor echo as if it came from another world. Her colleague, Adam Shalai, offered her a tired smile as he left the nurse's station to fetch supplies. "It will be another quiet night," he murmured, though his voice carried little conviction. In truth, every nurse in Budapest knew that the nights were never quiet. They only pretended to keep fear at bay. Esther moved to room 12, where an elderly patient, Istvan Farkas, lay pale and still. The man had been admitted after collapsing in his flat on the Buda side of the river. His eyes were closed, his breath shallow, the steady beeping of the monitor beside him the only sign that life had not yet slipped away. As Esther checked the 4-line, a faint creak echoed down the corridor. She froze, her pulse rising. The sound was slow, deliberate, as if footsteps were pacing just beyond the door. She turned, but the hallway lay empty. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then steadied. She shook her head, telling herself it was only the old building shifting against the cold night. Yet the unease settled deep in her chest. She glanced at the patient again. For the briefest second, she thought she saw his lips move. Esther leaned closer, holding her breath. The air felt icy against her skin, though the room's radiator hummed softly. But Istvan lay motionless, as though carved in stone. When Adam returned, carrying a tray of medicines, he noticed her pale expression. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied quickly, though her voice trembled. She returned to the nurse's desk, trying to dismiss the thought. But she could not ignore the feeling that someone else was walking those corridors, unseen yet terribly present. The shift had only just begun. The clock above the nurse's desk ticked slowly, its hands dragging across the dial as though reluctant to move. Midnight had come and gone. The hospital had grown even quieter, the city outside dissolving into a deep and dreamless slumber. Esther rose from her chair, compelled to check on room 12 once more. A strange pressure lingered in her chest, urging her back to the old man's bedside. The corridor seemed longer now, the shadows at its far end darker than before. She could hear her own breathing, sharp and deliberate, as though she were trespassing in a place not meant for the living. When she entered the room, the faint beep of the monitor greeted her. It was steady, reassuring. Istvan Farkas lay just as she had left him, his body fragile against the crisp white sheets. She leaned closer to adjust the wires. Then it came. A whisper. So faint she thought at first it was the hiss of the radiator. But the words were there, slipping through cracked lips. Her blood turned cold as she realized the man was speaking. Na inged bot. The words in Hungarian were weak, broken, but their meaning was clear. Do not let him in. Esther staggered back, knocking the clipboard from her hand. It struck the floor with a dull clap that seemed far too loud for the stillness of the room. Istvan's eyes remained closed. His breathing continued shallow, almost mechanical. Adam appeared at the doorway, drawn by the noise. "What happened?" he asked. Esther struggled for words. "He spoke," she whispered, her throat dry. But his eyes never opened. Adam frowned, stepping inside. "That is not possible. He has been unconscious since the afternoon." He checked the patient's vitals, calm but focused. Everything on the monitor appeared stable. Still, Esther could not shake the sound of the words. They replayed again and again in her mind. Not a warning, but a plea. Outside the room, the corridor groaned with another sound. It was heavier than before, like something dragging across the floor. Both nurses turned their heads toward the dark stretch of hallway. The lights hummed above them, but shadows seemed to shift against the walls. Adam forced a small laugh. "Old building," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. He scribbled notes on the chart and handed it back to Esther. "Come on, you need to rest your head. Do not let the night play tricks on you." But Esther could not rest. As she placed the clipboard back onto the desk, she noticed the hands of the wall clock twitch unnaturally, as though the second hand were trying to turn but kept being pulled backwards. The night was no longer ordinary. Something had entered St. Margaret Hospital, something unseen yet dangerously close. The early hours crept on with agonizing slowness. The hospital felt as though it had drifted away from Budapest, becoming a place suspended between night and dawn, where time obeyed its own rules. Esther sat at the desk, staring at the chart in front of her, yet unable to read a single line. The words of Istvin still pulsed in her mind. "Do not let him in." Who was he? And how could a man who had not woken in days find the strength to speak? The silence was broken by the faint rattle of a trolley. Esther looked up, expecting to see Adam pushing supplies down the hall. But the corridor was empty. The sound, however, continued. A slow metallic clatter, wheels squeaking against the tiles, moving closer. She rose from her seat, heart pounding, and stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered above, one by one, as though something unseen passed beneath them. The sound of the trolley stopped abruptly. Only the echo of her breath filled the space. Adam appeared from the far end, holding a file under his arm. He looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Why are you standing there like that?" Esther's voice trembled. "Did you hear it? The trolley." "There is no one else here tonight," Adam replied, his tone calm but firm. "You are tired, Esther. The night shift does this to everyone." But when she turned her head, she saw it. A shadow, far down the corridor, pressed flat against the wall. It was tall, its outlines stretched unnaturally thin, as though the figure did not belong to the shape of a man. The moment her eyes met it, the shadow slid silently into the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run back to the safety of the nurse's station, but her legs would not move. Adam reached her side, gripping her arm. "Do not stare too long at empty walls," he whispered, as if afraid the walls themselves might be listening. They returned to the desk together, but the atmosphere had shifted. The hospital no longer felt like stone and plaster. It felt alive, breathing, waiting. From room 12 came the faintest sound. Not a whisper this time, but the scraping of fingernails against metal. Istvin had begun to stir. Esther pushed open the door to room 12, her breath shallow as she stepped inside. The air was colder than before, so cold that her fingers ached as she reached for the light switch. The fluorescent lamp above buzzed to life, spilling a harsh, white glow across the room. Istvin Farkas was moving. His hands, frail and thin, scraped against the metal side rails of the bed. His eyelids fluttered, and with sudden force, his eyes snapped open. They were pale, almost gray, and fixed directly on Esther. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Esther felt her pulse hammering in her throat. She wanted to speak, but found her voice locked away. Then, in a rasp that seemed torn from deep within him, Istvin spoke again. "Bot." The same words. "Do not let him in." Louder this time. More urgent. Adam rushed into the room, drawn by the sound. He froze at the sight of the old man sitting halfway upright, despite the machines and wires tethered to his frail body. "This should not be possible," he muttered under his breath. Esther steadied herself and leaned closer. "Mr. Farkas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who? Who must we not let in?" But the man's eyes widened with terror, darting to the doorway as though something lurked just beyond the threshold. His body convulsed, and the monitor erupted into wild beeping. Adam rushed to restrain him, calling Esther to adjust the floor. The air grew heavy, pressing down upon them, as if the walls themselves leaned closer. In the corner of her vision, Esther saw the shadow again, stretched along the far wall of the room, darker than the night itself. It bent unnaturally, its edges curling like smoke, yet there was no source to cast it. She blinked, and it was gone. But Istvin screamed, his voice breaking into a raw, guttural cry that filled every corner of the ward. Then, As suddenly as it began, the cry ceased. His body went limp, collapsing back against the bed. The monitor steadied once more, the rhythmic beeping slow but stable. His eyes closed as if nothing had happened. Esther's hands shook as she pulled away. Adam looked at her, his face pale. Neither of them spoke. In the silence that followed, the old radiator in the corner hissed softly, though the air remained as cold as stone. The night was far from over. The hospital's long corridors stretched like veins through the darkened building. Esther and Adam left room 12 in silence, both unwilling to speak of what they had witnessed. The sound of their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the building were amplifying every movement. At the end of the hallway, a door stood closed. It was the old supply room, a place few nurses used anymore since it had been moved to a newer wing. The handle gleamed faintly under the pale lights. Esther froze as she noticed it was trembling, slowly, rhythmically, as if someone on the other side was pushing against it. Adam saw it too. His jaw tightened. The room is locked. No one should be in there. But the trembling grew stronger. A soft, dragging scrape followed, like fingernails raking down the wooden surface. Esther felt her breath catch, her heart urging her to run. Instead, she whispered, "Do you hear it?" Adam nodded once. He stepped closer, his hand hovering above the handle but never daring to touch it. The noise ceased at once. The silence that followed was so sudden, so complete, it was more terrifying than the sound itself. Esther stared at the door, unable to look away. She thought she saw a shadow seeping through the narrow gap beneath it. A smear of darkness, alive, curling and twisting against the cold floor tiles. "Back away," Adam ordered quietly, his tone firm but hushed. "Do not open it. Whatever it is, it belongs on the other side." They retreated slowly, their eyes fixed on the door as they moved. Esther's skin prickled as though unseen fingers trailed down her spine. The moment they turned the corner, a deafening bang shook the corridor. Something had hurled itself against the locked door with brutal force. The echo rolled through the hospital, rattling glass panes and making the ceiling lights flicker. Esther clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. Adam pulled her away, his steps quickening. As they reached the nurse's station, the phone on the desk began to ring. Not once, not twice, but in a relentless, shrill tone that seemed to pierce through bone. Adam hesitated before picking up the receiver. His face drained of color as he pressed it to his ear. For a long moment he listened, frozen. Then he slowly lowered the handset, his hand trembling. "What was it?" Esther asked, her voice breaking. He swallowed hard. It was Mr. Farkas. His voice, repeating the same words over and over. Esther's heart sank. "Do not let him in." The ringing of the telephone still echoed in Esther's ears as she sank into the chair by the nurse's desk. Adam placed the receiver back into its cradle, his hand trembling, his face drained of color. Neither of them spoke. The silence weighed heavy, like a thick blanket pressing down upon the ward. Then the lights above flickered. Once. Twice. The hum of electricity faded into nothing. The corridor plunged into darkness. Esther gasped, her breath quick and shallow. The emergency lights flicked on a second later, casting the hospital in a dim red glow. Shadows lengthened across the walls, grotesque and unnatural. The familiar hallways no longer looked like stone and plaster, but like the interior of a place abandoned long ago. Adam grabbed a small torch from the desk drawer and switched it on. Its weak beam cut through the gloom, trembling slightly in his hand. "Power outage," he muttered, though even he did not sound convinced. The storm outside, perhaps. But Esther knew there was no storm. The sky had been clear when she arrived. She stood, her body tense, and whispered, "The machines." They both rushed back to room 12. The heart monitor that had kept steady through the night was now dead, its screen black. Yet Istvan still lay breathing, shallow and uneven. Esther touched his wrist, her fingers brushing against his fragile skin. The pulse was there, weak but steady. The machines had failed, but the man lived on. Then the whisper came again. Not from Istvan this time, but from the darkened corner of the room. A voice, deep and hollow, curling through the air like smoke. Words in Hungarian, yet twisted, distorted, as if spoken from the depths of a well. Adam swung the torch toward the sound. The beam struck the far wall, and for the briefest second, Esther saw it. A figure stretched tall, its limbs impossibly long, its face a void darker than the surrounding shadows. The light faltered. When it steadied again, the corner was empty. Esther stumbled back, her body shaking. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. But Adam shook his head. "We cannot leave him. He asked us not to let it in." The corridor outside groaned. A door slammed shut, echoing like thunder through the hospital. They were no longer alone. The silence that followed was worse than the slam of the door. Esther and Adam stood frozen in room 12, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting to the darkened corridor beyond. The emergency lights pulsed faintly, casting the hospital in shifting waves of red that made the walls appear as though they were breathing. Then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Each one echoed against the tiled floor, starting at the far end of the corridor and moving steadily closer. Esther gripped the edge of the bed, her knuckles white. The sound was wrong, she realized. Too drawn out, as though whoever or whatever was walking dragged their weight with each step. Adam raised the torch, aiming it at the doorway. The beam wavered with his trembling hands, but the corridor appeared empty. Still, the footsteps continued, drawing nearer with every second. "Stay here," he whispered. Esther shook her head fiercely. "You cannot go out there." But Adam stepped forward, his body tense, the torchlight slicing through the gloom. The sound of the steps stopped abruptly, as if the presence had paused just out of sight. The silence pressed down again, thick and unbearable. Then, from directly behind them, the footsteps resumed. Esther spun around, her heart slamming in her chest. The sound was inside the room now, circling them, though the floor beneath was empty. The air grew colder, their breaths visible in pale mist. Istvan stirred, his lips moving, forming the same broken words he had spoken before. "Do not let him in." The voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the room like thunder. Adam grabbed Esther's arm. "We must move," he hissed. Together they rushed into the corridor, the torch beam jerking wildly across the walls. Behind them, the monitor in room 12 flickered to life for a brief moment, though no power fed it. Its screen glowed bright green, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then it stopped. The footsteps followed them into the hall, faster now, echoing from all directions. Something unseen was hunting them. Esther and Adam hurried down the dim corridors, the echo of the pursuing footsteps never far behind. The hospital twisted into a maze under the glow of the red emergency lights, every hallway looking the same, every door shut tight, as if the building itself conspired to trap them. They descended a flight of stairs, the sound of their footsteps clashing with the heavier ones that followed. The air grew colder with each step, dampness seeping from the stone beneath. At the bottom, they reached a locked iron gate. A faded sign hung above it, the lettering in Hungarian spelling out chapel. This hospital had a chapel? Esther whispered. She had worked here for months and never known. Adam forced the gate open with a groan of rusted hinges. The air that greeted them was ancient, heavy with the scent of dust and forgotten prayers. They stepped inside. The chapel was small, hidden beneath the hospital like a secret. Wooden pews stood in crooked rows, their surfaces scarred by time. A crucifix hung on the far wall, its figure worn smooth by age. Candle holders lined the altar, though no flames had burned in them for decades. For the first time that night, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Esther's eyes swept the room, her body trembling. "Why here?" she whispered. Adam's face was pale in the glow of the torch. "The old wing was built over a church," he murmured. "Some say it was never truly abandoned. Perhaps that is why he brought us here." As if in answer, Istvan's voice echoed faintly, though the old man lay floors above them. The words drifted through the chapel like a chant. "Do not let him in." Esther clutched the edge of a pew, her heart racing. The crucifix above the altar creaked. Slowly, the wooden figure twisted, as though some invisible force pressed against it. Adam raised the torch, the beam cutting through the shadows. For an instant, a figure stood at the back of the chapel.
Tall.
Black as ash. Its face nothing but a hollow void. The torchlight flickered. The figure vanished. Esther's knees weakened. It has followed us here. Adam nodded grimly.
No.
It has always been here. The chapel doors slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. They were trapped. The slam of the chapel doors reverberated through the stone walls. Dust fell from the beams above, drifting through the dim, red light. Esther spun toward the entrance, but the iron handles refused to move. They were sealed, as if welded shut by unseen hands. The chapel grew colder still. Their breaths spilled into the air in white clouds. The silence was not empty anymore. It felt crowded, thick with something unseen. Esther's skin prickled as though countless eyes were watching from the shadows. Adam swept the torch across the pews. His beam halted. Figures sat there, row after row, pew after pew, filled with pale shapes. They were motionless, heads bowed, their forms hazy, as though carved from mist. The silent congregation of the chapel. None of them moved, but the weight of their presence pressed down like stone. Esther clutched Adam's arm. Her whisper cracked. They were not here before. Adam's voice was tight. Do not speak to them. Do not look at them too long. They moved carefully along the side aisle, the torch beam trembling as it passed the bowed heads. Every shadow seemed to shift when the light struck it. A faint murmur rippled through the air, too soft to be words, like the rustling of dry leaves. At the altar, Esther's gaze caught on the crucifix once more. The wooden figure was no longer bent. Its head had turned, its hollow eyes staring directly at her. She stumbled back, her breath choking. From the pews, the congregation rose as one. Their movements were slow, deliberate, yet soundless. Heads lifting in eerie unison, faces pale and eyeless, their mouths opening in silent screams. Adam raised the torch higher, the light quivering across their faces. Stay behind me, he whispered. But the figures did not advance. They parted, leaving a narrow path down the center of the chapel. At the far end, beyond the altar, stood the tall figure Esther had glimpsed before. Its body swayed like smoke, its arms impossibly long, its presence blotting out even the dim emergency glow. It did not move closer. It only waited. Esther felt her knees weaken. Her heart thundered against her ribs. She finally understood. The congregation was not there to harm them. They were there to witness. And the figure at the altar was what Istvan had begged them to resist.
Do not let him in.
The chapel pulsed with a silence, so heavy it crushed the breath from Esther's lungs. The congregation of pale figures stood still, their eyeless faces turned toward the altar. At its center, the tall shadow swayed, its form shifting as if made from smoke and ash. Adam's hand tightened around the torch. Its beam wavered across the black void where the figure's face should have been. It wants us to open the way, he whispered, voice raw. That is why Farkas warned us. It cannot come through unless they allowed it. Esther's eyes darted to the crucifix above the altar. The wood cracked sharply, splinters falling to the floor. The figure nailed to the cross twisted unnaturally, its arms bending as though it tried to tear itself free. The air grew thick, pressing down upon them. The shadow raised its head, and for the first time, Esther heard it speak. The voice was low, hollow, carried not through her ears, but directly inside her skull. Open. Her knees buckled. Every instinct screamed to obey, to lower her guard, and let the darkness in. Her body trembled, her hand rising of its own accord toward the altar. No. Adam seized her wrist, his grip desperate. His voice shook. This is what it wants. If we let it in, it will never leave this place. The congregation shifted, their mouths opening wider, a silent roar filling the chapel, though no sound escaped. The figure at the altar extended one impossibly long arm. At its fingertip, a thin crack split the air, a seam of darkness spreading outward like glass about to shatter. Esther forced her body back, choking against the weight pressing down upon her. She clutched the crucifix chain around her neck, a gift from her mother, and raised it high. The small silver cross caught the faint glow of the torch, its light trembling but defiant. The shadow recoiled. The seam in the air quivered, then shrank. A hiss tore through the chapel, not with sound but with a violent shudder that rattled the pews. "Close it," Adam shouted. "Do not let it in." Esther focused every fragment of her will, holding the cross forward. Her voice broke, but she forced the words out. "You cannot enter." The congregation shuddered as though struck. One by one, the pale figures collapsed into mist, vanishing into nothing. The shadow writhed, twisting in fury, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The crack in the air sealed with a thunderous snap. Then silence. The chapel stood empty. No figures. No shadow. Only Esther and Adam remained, shaking, breathless. The iron doors creaked open behind them. The emergency lights flickered once, twice, and steadied. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by the ordinary chill of an old hospital at night. They stumbled back into the corridor, leaving the chapel in silence. Above them, in room 12, Isvan Farkas lay still. His lips parted in a faint, final breath. And then he was gone.